Hey, how's it going, guys? In this video, I'm going to be doing a tutorial and walkthrough of the Gregtech 6 Fission Reactor system. This video is being recorded on Gregtech 6 version 6.17.01. If you are playing on a different version of Gregtech 6, namely a more recent version, I highly recommend you check the change logs and make sure that none of the fission reactor mechanics have been updated since this video has been recorded, because if they have, then the information here is probably going to be outdated and will not produce the same results for you as it will for me. So for your own safety and consideration, double check the version of Gregtech 6 that you're currently playing on. So before we get into building the reactors and going through all of those mechanics, I want to briefly touch on radiation and tell you how to avoid it. So the sources of radiation in Gregtech 6 are the reactor cores themselves when they're turned on and have fuel rods in them. The fuel rods themselves, if you hold them, will give you radiation. And raw radioactive materials such as uranium-235 in any form, whether that be ingot, rod, dust, whatever, if you pick that up, you will accumulate radiation on your character. And what radiation will do is give you nausea, it'll give you hunger, and it'll also damage you over time. And it will become more severe the more exposure you have to it, or if the intensity of the radiation is high enough. Reactors, when they're turned on, will emit more severe radiation at longer distances depending on how high you run these. And I'll explain how that works later on. But just keep in mind, it's really not advisable to run these near your base at all if you can afford it. And if you can manage it, I would really highly recommend you build these in a different dimension in order to avoid you becoming irradiated and to avoid your friends or your animals or your villagers or whatever. All entities will be at risk of accumulating radiation depending on how powerful this reactor becomes when you run it. So avoid that as much as possible. Build it far away or build it in a different dimension ideally. Obviously, you will have to handle radiation yourself because you're going to need to build these fuel rods and you're going to need to handle these different radioactive materials. So, in order to prevent yourself from accumulating radiation, you can wear this full radiation hazard suit, and that will make you totally immune to radiation from all sources. You need to have the full suit. Otherwise, you can still accumulate radiation and you could still die from it. So make sure you build that full suit before you start handling any radioactive materials at all, or if you go near your reactor when it's running, always make sure you're wearing that radiation hazard suit. I would highly recommend if you have it in a different dimension, you just put it by a portal or whatever that you use to access that dimension. Just put the suit there, keep it always in your eyes. That way you can always see it and put it on before you deal with the reactor. That being said, if you do get radiation, you can take Radaway pills to cure it, and it will reduce your radiation severity by one. It doesn't always do it with one pill, so you might have to take two or three to get rid of all the sources of radiation on you, but those will remove it. Otherwise, you could just die and get rid of the radiation, but obviously that's not ideal for most cases. Now that we've gone over the radiation mechanics, we can start talking about the nuclear reactor core. If you look in NEI when you go to craft these nuclear reactor cores, you might notice that there's a 1x1 and a 2x2 nuclear reactor core. The 1x1 reactor core is disabled by default. It doesn't have a recipe, and I recommend you just forget that it exists because it doesn't work the way the 2x2 reactor does. It doesn't interact nicely, and the 2x2 reactor core is the intended way to use this system. So you're going to want to craft yourself at least one of these, and optimally three of them if this is your first time building your reactor. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the top of these, you might notice that there is a 2x2 grid, just like what the item description says, of these little gray squares on top. What these gray squares are slots for reactor rods. So for example, if I take these neutron reflector rods and insert them into those slots by right-clicking, you'll see they go directly into those slots, and they are kind of black on the edges. That is a disabled and inserted nuclear reactor rod. If I wanted to enable those, I could take a soft hammer and right click on the reactor, and you'll notice that they turn white. That means those rods are active. And these are just reactor reflector rods, so they don't really do anything by themselves. This is sort of just to demonstrate the visual difference. And the reason why I said you might want to make three of these when you first start is because the way that the reactor rods work is that they will check each adjacent side in the cardinal direction. So that's north, south, east, west, and they will try to see if they can interact with the rod in those directions. If you only build one or even two of these, you'll notice you don't get to actually utilize the full four directions of each rod. What that really matters for is for the fuel rods, because the fuel rods are what actually get depleted and consumed in this process. All the other rods are effectively infinite for you. But if you only build one or two, you're not going to get access to all those sides, so you're not going to be able to control them as well. You're not going to be able to get as many benefits out of them, as much power, etc. So ideally, you want three reactor cores when you first start out. That way, you can put one reactor rod right in the middle there, a fuel rod, and that way you'll be able to have all four sides available to you to insert other kinds of rods. So this is sort of the basic beginner setup, and obviously as you go along, you can start to add more reactors like this, and you'll have access to all the sides of all the rods very easily. But just to start out, you're going to want to build three of these, and that way you can at least run just one fuel rod with all of its sides accessible, and that will get you started on breeding. It'll get you started on really effective power generation. So this is sort of the ideal basic setup. Now that we've gone over the basics of the reactor core, we can start talking about the fuel rods that I mentioned earlier. If you look in NEI, there's quite a few different fuel rods, and they all have different stats on them. In addition to that, you'll notice that those stats change when the material that they can be used with rotates. So you'll see it goes through sodium, tin, helium, and a bunch of other materials, and all of those stats underneath change in accordance with that. So you'll see there's emission, self, maximum, and factor. All of those change depending on the coolant, which is what those are, rotates in NEI. However, it's a bit hard to kind of understand how this actually works because you don't really see what the default stats are. You only see what the modifications are with each coolant, and it's really quite difficult to parse all of that out. So what I've done is I've looked on the Gregtech 6 forums, and somebody has compiled a really nice little spreadsheet that has all of the default stats of all the fuel rods, as well as the modifications that the coolants make to those fuel rods. So that's really helpful, and I'll include that in the description. But what I've done here is set up some signs that kind of describe the first fuel rod's innate stats, and that's going to be the uranium-235 fuel rod. That's the one that you're going to be starting out with most likely. So you'll see there are a couple of just default stats here. So you have the self, the emission, the maximum, the factor, and the duration. So I'm going to go through these and explain what these all mean so you can understand. So the self describes how many neutrons are going to be on that fuel rod at all times by default. So if I were to place down this reactor and I put a uranium-235 fuel rod in there, and then I put a Geiger counter sensor on there, you will be able to see when I turn this on that it will briefly have 32 neutrons on it, but then the reactor rod is going to vaporize itself because there is no coolant in the reactor, and it will immediately disintegrate because all of the heat is just going to be put onto the rod and it will just destroy itself. But I can demonstrate that briefly. You can see 32 neutrons appeared on that Geiger counter sensor. Just as a side note, these Geiger counter sensors, as well as the Geiger counter handheld item, are really useful for running these reactors, and I would almost go as far as to say that they're mandatory to run these. You will almost never be able to do anything with these unless you're extremely knowledgeable or you're just willing to take the risk. It's not worth running these without these, basically. At the very least, make yourself the Geiger counter sensors. The handheld Geiger counter isn't super useful because you have to use it manually, but you'll see that if you right-click on the reactor core with the Geiger counter, you can see the neutrons that are present on all four of the fuel rods in the reactor. So that's what all of those four numbers mean. And you can actually see that the reactor is on here. And I can turn that off and you'll see that reflected in the tooltip when I use the Geiger counter sensor. The difference between the handheld one and the one that you can place against the reactor is that the one here that you actually physically place in the world will give you a sum of the neutrons in the reactor. Whereas this one, the handheld one, will give you a count for all four of the rods individually. This becomes kind of important and relevant later on, but just as a note, this gives you the sum. So if you have multiple fuel rods in here, or if you have absorber rods and fuel rods, it'll give you the total. It will not give you a reading off of just one of those, and that cannot be changed. So just keep that in mind for your setups. But yeah, the demonstration I've just done is to show that indeed there are 32 neutrons on that rod by default. Next, the emission stat is also 32, just like the self. So what that means is that when you put a rod in here and you put any other rod next to it, whether that be reflectors or absorbers, this rod will emit 32 neutrons onto any adjacent rod. So for example, if I put a neutron absorber rod with this uranium-235 fuel rod, this rod will have 32 neutrons. It'll emit 32 onto this absorber rod, and this rod will also have 32 neutrons on it at all times because of the emission of this one. So when I turn this on, you'll see that it will have 64 total neutrons in the reactor. And just like that, you see there's 64 neutrons. So this is sort of how you can start to think about this setup over here, where if you have all four sides available, you will be able to output neutrons onto all four sides because of the emission stat. And if I show that again over here, now if I put two absorber rods, I should have 32 more, and you'll see there's 96 neutrons. So that's, or sorry, 32, not 34, but that's 32 plus 32 plus 32, which means there's 96 neutrons with the two absorber rods and the fuel rod. So the emission, once again, is how many neutrons that the fuel rod emits onto all adjacent fuel rods. Next, we have the maximum stat, and this maximum stat doesn't really mean too much unless you also understand the duration stat. So the duration stat is how many minutes the fuel rod by default will last inside of that reactor if you run it all the time. So if you just put this uranium-235 fuel rod in here and you just put a coolant in there that doesn't have any effect on most of the stats, it will last for 10,000 minutes, which is quite a long time. But where the maximum comes into play here is that if you ever have 2048 neutrons on this rod, if you go above that, the rod will start to deplete faster. And we haven't really seen numbers that high yet, but I will show you later on how you can achieve that and actually why it's beneficial potentially to get close to that number or above it. But just keep in mind, the more neutrons that you put on the rod that exceed its maximum stat, the faster the duration will deplete. And it's still not that important. I would say it's still better to exceed that most of the time, and I'll show you why later on once again. But don't be too concerned with this maximum, but keep in mind if you do want to preserve your rods as much as possible, say for example, you just want to set and forget kind of power source, you want to keep underneath that maximum while still getting as close to it as possible. And the reason why that is because the more neutrons you have inside of the reactor, the more heat you're generating. So the neutrons directly correspond to the heat that's emitted into the coolant. And really, it's actually emitted into the reactor block, and then the reactor block puts the heat into the coolant. But just to make it very simple, neutrons equals heat. So if you have coolant in here and you have neutrons in the reactor, that coolant will be turned into hot coolant. So that's how you sort of generate power with this. If you put water in here, it'll turn to steam. If you put any other kind of coolant like sodium or molten tin or something, it'll turn into hot coolant. And you can use heat exchangers just like you would with a boiler or anything like that. And that's how you would make power with these. So the more neutrons you have in the reactor, the more potential power you can extract from it. So the final and most important stat for our fuel rods is this factor stat. The reason why this is the most important stat is because this will determine whether or not your reactor is able to go critical. What critical means is that the reactor will start to accumulate neutrons over time, and it'll go up and up and up infinitely unless you control it. So the way that this stat actually works is that the rod will first take the amount of neutrons that it has on itself from all the different sources, it'll multiply it by this factor, and then it'll add that to its total as a bonus. So essentially, without going into the math too much, what this means is that if you look at the denominator, that's how many neutron sources you need around the fuel rod in order to gain a bonus that will allow you to continuously increase your neutrons or go critical, like I said before. So visually, how this is represented, or how you can think about this, is that if your factor is, for example, 1 over 4, you need 4 neutron sources around whatever fuel rod you're dealing with. So in this case, uranium-235. A neutron source can be other fuel rods, or it can be reflector rods, or technically it can even be moderator rods. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But For all intents and purposes, a factor is really just a count of how many adjacent fuel rods you need in order for your reactor to increase its neutron count over time, or again, to go critical. Keep in mind, 1 over 4 is the absolute minimum that you need in order to go critical. If your factor is 1 over 5, you cannot go critical. If you're 1 over 3, you're fine. You would only need 3 adjacent fuel sources, or rather neutron sources, in order to go critical. So just keep in mind, a factor is, once again, the count of adjacent neutron sources needed to continuously increase your neutron count over time. So the final core concept that we want to go over before we start building reactors is the concept of coolant. Now, just like with the fuel rods, there's going to be lots of different kinds of coolant, and each coolant is going to have its associated set of stats that will modify the behavior of the reactor. The way that coolant works is that you pump it into the reactor with pipes into the tank here. So tank 0 will hold the coolant, and that tank is 64 buckets large. The reactor will then use that coolant to cool itself down, and it'll eject hot coolant into tank 1, which is also 64 buckets large. That hot coolant will then be ejected from this face here, the red face, into pipes or tanks or whatever, and then you can pipe that into heat exchangers. And the heat exchangers will then use that to generate heat, and then they'll output the normal coolant back out this face, and then you can put that into the reactor, and you'll have a nice little coolant loop. Every coolant, except for distilled water, will generate hot coolant at a 1-to-1 ratio, so you never have to worry about any losses or anything like that. It's always going to be 1-to-1, except for distilled water. And the reason why distilled water is different is because distilled water turns into steam, kind of like in a boiler. Now, the benefit of that is that you don't need the heat exchanger set up and a boiler in order to extract rotation units and energy from your coolant. It'll just go directly into steam, and then you just put it into a steam turbine. So that's sort of the benefit of distilled water. There are some downsides, namely that the amount of steam that's generated is much larger, obviously, than the other coolants will convert into hot coolants. So, 1 liter of distilled water might turn into 100 liters of steam. And that means that your output pipe will need to be proportionately larger than with any other kind of coolant. So just keep that in mind. If you use distilled water, you're going to need a lot more output than you will input. Having said that, let's go on to cover the stats of distilled water just so we can understand sort of how they work. So heat capacity is a measurement of the amount of heat units that you can remove from the reactor per liter of your coolant. For distilled water, that number is going to be 0.5. So distilled water can only remove half of a heat unit per liter in the reactor. That's not great. That means you need a very, very high throughput of water to remove heat from that reactor. And that means that your already large pipe system may even need to be larger than you think, because you need to constantly flow water through in order to remove all of that heat. Most coolants will have a much higher heat capacity, and so you might end up having a coolant that has 10 or 20 heat units per liter that it's able to remove from the reactor. So you don't need nearly as many or as large pipes as you would for distilled water. So just keep that in mind. Heat capacity is how many heat units per liter of your coolant you can remove from the reactor. The amplifier stats are all multipliers to whatever stat they're referring to. So amplifier for heat is a multiplier to how many heat units you get per neutron in the reactor. Normally, you get 1 heat unit per neutron in the reactor, but say you had an amplifier of 2 instead of 1, that means you would get 2 heat units per neutron in the reactor. For self, emission, and maximum, those are referring to the stats on the fuel rods, and they will accordingly multiply whatever those stats are by whatever number they represent. So say we had an amplifier of 2 times for self. That means that self would be multiplied by 2 on whatever fuel rod we're dealing with. So in this case, for uranium-235, it would be multiplied by 2, so we get 64. If we had a 0.5 multiplier for our self, that means we would have a 16 self stat instead. And likewise for emission and maximum, they're all affected in the same way by their according stats. For the factor divisor, it works a little differently. So we multiply the divisor of the factor by whatever our number is there. So say we had a factor of 2, that means we would multiply the factor here by 2. So we would have a 1/8 factor. And what that means is that the reactor will no longer be able to go critical in a normal configuration of a reactor with reflector rods or with other fuel rods. And that may be a bad thing in your case if you are intending to make a critical reactor that you want to increase neutrons on, because you're not going to be able to do it anymore if your factor is that low. You need at least a factor of 1/4 if you want to make a critical reactor. So just keep that in mind. If that modifies your factor to that point, you're not going to be able to go critical. Moving on to the offset of the factor divisor, the stat will only ever be 0 or -1. And what this stat does is it is a thing you add to the factor divisor. So if it's 0, you don't add anything. If it's -1, you subtract 1 from the factor divisor here. And what would that actually do is it will raise this fraction to a higher value, and it makes it so that you need less adjacent neutron sources in order for the fuel rod to go critical. So that's actually quite a big boost to the ability of the reactor. That means you get an extra face to deal with on your fuel rod. It also just means it's easier to raise the neutron levels in your reactor if you so choose. Now, the final stat is a little more complicated than the others, and that's the moderate stat. So this will either be a 0 or a 1. If it's 0, it's not going to moderate your fuel rods. If it's 1, it is going to moderate your fuel rods. Now, what is a moderated fuel rod? A moderated fuel rod is a fuel rod that is inside of a reactor that is filled with a coolant that does moderation. And those fuel rods, if they are enabled inside of that reactor, will permanently become moderated. So just keep in mind, even if you turn it on and then turn it off, that fuel rod will become moderated permanently, even if you move that to a completely different reactor with a completely different coolant. Now, what does moderation actually do? Well, moderation, first of all, makes it so that your fuel rod lasts only 1/4 as long as it normally does. So if your duration is 10,000 minutes normally, you will only get 2,500 minutes out of a moderated fuel rod of that equivalent material. The next thing it does is it makes it so that the fuel rod cannot be used at all under any circumstances for breeding. Now, we haven't covered breeding yet, and I'll explain what it is later on, but just keep in mind, moderated fuel rods are completely unable to do breeding. The final effect of moderated fuel rods is that they will spread their moderated status to other adjacent fuel rods, even if those fuel rods are not in a coolant that does moderation. So, for example, if I were to fill this reactor core with molten sodium, which is not a moderating coolant, and then I put distilled water in this one and I turn them both on, even though this fuel rod is not in a coolant that moderates, and this one will spread its moderated status to this one. And this one would also become permanently moderated, even though it itself is not in a coolant that is moderated. So just keep that in mind. It's almost like a virus that'll spread through your reactor. So make sure if you're going to be dealing with moderated stuff, you actually want the stuff that is in your reactor to spread that moderation around, because it's not reversible and you will potentially, lose your fuel rod that you might not want to be moderated. So just keep in mind all those effects. So now that we've covered the basics of the reactor stats and all of the components, I'm going to build a small demonstration reactor just so you can see how all of that stuff meshes together. So we'll make a single reactor core, and we will use distilled water as our coolant because, like I said before, it's very simple. So we'll place our reactor core. This red face is going to be our hot coolant output. And the blue face is actually not going to be used here, but what it is the coolant sharing face. So you toggle that one with the monkey wrench to move it around. And what it does is it shares the coolant from this reactor core with any adjacent reactor cores. It's not really useful if you have just one reactor core, but say you had it set up like this, all of the blue faces would be sharing their coolants with the reactors that it is facing into. But for this case, because we're not going to be using it, if we put it into the same direction as the hot coolant output, it will completely disable that coolant sharing face and only keep the hot coolant output enabled. So now that we have that hot coolant output there, we'll put a steam turbine here because, like I said before, the distilled water will boil directly into steam. So we can put that directly into the turbine. We can capture the distilled water from that turbine, put it into a drum, which I'll put here. We'll let the drum fill vertically adjacent tanks. We will put a pipe to fill the reactor again with distilled water. We will put a fluidometer just so we can look at this. And just keep in mind, just in case you don't know, steam turbines actually destroy some of the distilled water that is used to make the steam that runs them. It's only a small amount, but it will eventually, over time, completely get rid of all of your distilled water. So if you're going to copy this setup, make sure you have a way to generate more distilled water. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where your reactor does not have coolant. And if your reactor doesn't have coolant, or if it backs up with hot coolant, whichever happens, it will vaporize everything inside of it. So just don't let that happen. It's not a good thing. So let's put some distilled water in here. You'll see it's filling the reactor. You can see that tank 0, like I described before, is filling up. It's got 64 buckets in it now. And we will just fill up this bronze drum because it completely drained into the reactor. And we want to have a little bit of backup inside of our drum. So now this loop is fully complete. So the reactor will boil water into steam, output that steam into the turbine. The turbine will spin, and I'll put a little axle here so we can kind of record that, and I'll put a dynamo on it too, just so that we can get a representation of just how much is actually coming out of it. The distilled water will come out of the turbine, go into the tank, and then flow back into the reactor. So that's our closed coolant loop there. We will take a uranium-235 rod and we'll put it in there, and we will take a Geiger counter sensor and we'll put it on the reactor. And if we turn this on, we will see that we are now generating some energy here, but only a little bit, and you'll see this axle is having some trouble turning. It's very slow and it's only doing it sporadically. So right now, we're not generating very much energy at all. We're only actually going to be generating 32 heat units because we only have 32 neutrons. What we can do to increase that is put an absorber rod here. So absorber rods will generate twice as much heat per neutron as any other equivalent rod. So if we put that in and then turn the reactor back on with our soft hammer, we will now see we have 64 because uranium-235 is outputting 32 neutrons onto the absorber rod, and it is also putting 32 neutrons onto itself. So there's 32 here, 32 here. So there's actually 96 heat units being output because the absorber rod doubles, again, the amount of heat units that you get. So because there's 32, we're getting 64 heat from here. We're getting 32 heat from here, which is 96 total heat units. And that's going into here and using that to spin the turbine. You can see this is still not really consistently spinning this axle. It's very inconsistent and it's not going to be at an energy level that's really harvestable. So what we can do as well is we can put a reflector rod in here. If I have one, let's get a reflector rod. All right, no, that's a moderator rod. Whoops. There we go. Just need a reflector rod. We'll put that in there and we'll turn the reactor rods back on. And now you'll see our neutron count is sort of climbing, which we haven't seen before. And that's because of the factor that I described before. So we're getting a little bit of a bonus for reflecting some neutrons back onto this uranium fuel rod. And you'll see this is actually allowing this to spin at a much more consistent rate. It's spinning at 106 rotation units per tick, and it's very, very consistent. So what's happening is we can look with the Geiger counter sensor, the handheld one. We can see exactly what's happening. So one rod is going to have 75 neutrons. That's going to be the uranium rod. And the way we know that is because the uranium rod is outputting 32 on the reflector, has 32 on itself. The reflector is emitting some neutrons back onto here. It's going to emit 32 back on. That's going to be 64. And then we're gaining a little bit of the neutrons back as well from the factor stat as bonus. So that's where that 75 is coming from. There is also going to be a little bit of an increase in the amount that is emitted onto the absorber rod. So that's why we're having 118 neutrons in the reactor that you're measuring here. And that's why you can see that the 43 neutrons are on the absorber rod. So we're getting a little bit of a bonus to our emission and on the uranium-235 rod here. And you can see that this is spinning at a very consistent rate, but it is very occasionally dropping to 0 rotation units per tick. And The reason why that is just because we're not quite outputting enough steam to turn that turbine. But what we can do is actually use our pincers here to remove this absorber rod and instead put another reflector rod. And why that will actually result in a better outcome here is again due to the factor stat of the uranium-235. If your fuel has a factor of 1/4 or greater, so 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, or 1, which is, I guess, technically possible, but um, if your factor is 1/4 or better, it is always going to be better to use a reflector rod than it is to use an absorber rod for the purposes of generating energy. And the reason why is because of the bonus that you get for reflecting neutrons back into the fuel rod. So again, if your factor is 1/4 or better, then it is always better to use reflector rods. And now you can see it's 106 rotation units per tick, and it's very, very consistent. There's no drops down. And all we've done is put one fuel rod and two reflector rods in this reactor core. And we're able to generate quite a lot of rotation units, and we're actually going to be able to generate medium voltage power. And even though this is a moderated fuel rod because of the distilled water, we're still going to get 2,500 minutes rather, straight of power, basically for free. The only thing you'll ever have to put into this reactor at this point is an extra fuel rod every once in a while, and maybe some distilled water every, however long it takes for that to drain. If you wanted to, you could also put another fuel rod in here to increase the power even further. If we did that, we can turn this back on, and you'll see it's generating even more power, and it's going to exceed the power of that steam turbine. So we'd have to actually upgrade that if we wanted to make the most of it. But you can see that even just putting an extra fuel rod will greatly increase the number of neutrons, as you saw here on the Geiger counter. So it's really, really easy to scale up your power once you really have an understanding of how these reactors work. But as you can see, even a setup as compact as this, it really only occupies a 2 by 2 by 2 square for the purposes of the reactor, and then just the energy requires a little bit more. And you can see how compact this is for how much power you're getting. It's actually quite efficient. And you can use this to power your machines, you can use it to generate electricity, whatever you want to do. It's all doable with a very compact design. The only thing you'll have to be a little bit concerned about is, once again, the water and potentially the radiation that'll come out of this reactor. But yeah, this is the most basic kind of reactor you could make. I guess you could make an even simpler one if you just wanted to use thorium, I guess a more low-powered one, but I would say the uranium-235 is a good starting point for anybody trying to make their very first reactor, and this is a very good way of getting your feet wet with this mechanic.